Ms. Lewinsky's, how would you explain that?
Well, Mr. Bittman, I don't, first of all, when you asked me for a blood test, I gave you one promptly. You came over here and got it. And we met that night, talked. So that's a question you already know the answer to, not if, but you know whether. And the main thing I can tell you is that doesn't affect the opening statement I made. The opening statement I made is that I had inappropriate, intimate contact. I take full responsibility for it. It wasn't her fault, it was mine. I do not believe that I violated the definition of sexual relations I was given by directly touching those parts of her body with the intent to arouse or gratify. And that's all I have to say. I think for the rest, you know what the evidence is, and it doesn't affect that statement.
Is it possible or impossible that your semen is on a dress belonging to Miss Lewinsky?
I have nothing to add to my statement about it, sir. You know what the facts are. There's no point in a hypothetical.
Don't you know what the facts are also, Mr. President?
I have nothing to add to my statement, sir.
Getting back to the conversation you had with Mrs. Curry on January 18th, you told her, if she testified that you told her, Monica came on to me and I never touched her. You did, in fact, of course, touch Miss Lewinsky, isn't that right? In a physically intimate way?
Now, I've testified about that. And that's one of those questions that I believe is answered by the statement that I made.
What was your purpose in making these statements to Mrs. Curry if they weren't for the purpose to try to suggest to her what she should say if ever asked?
Now, Mr. Bittman, I told you, the only thing I remember is when all this stuff blew up, I was trying to figure out what the facts were. I was trying to remember. I was trying to remember every time I had seen Miss Lewinsky. Once this thing was in Drudge and there was this argument about what it was or was not going to be in Newsweek, that was a clear signal to me, because Newsweek, frankly, had become almost a sponsoring media outlet for the Paula Jones case, and had a journalist who had been trying so far fruitlessly to find me in some sort of wrongdoing. And so I knew this was all going to come out. I did not know at the time, I will say again, I did not know that any of you were involved. I did not know that the Office of Independent Counsel was involved. And I was trying to get the facts and trying to think of the best defense we could construct in the face of what I thought was going to be a media onslaught. Once you became involved, I told Betty Curry not to worry, that she had been through a terrible time. She'd lost her brother, she'd lost her sister, her mother was in the hospital. I said, Betty, just don't worry about me, just relax, go in there and tell the truth, you'll be fine. Now, that's all there was in this context.
Did the conversations that you had with Mrs. Curry, this conversation, did it refresh your recollection as to the events involving Miss Lewinsky?
Well, as I remember, I do believe, in fairness, that you know, she may have felt some ambivalence about how to react, because there were some times when she seemed to say yes when I'm not sure she meant yes. There was a time it seems like there was one or two things where she said, well, remember this, that, or the other thing, which did reflect my recollection. So I would say a little yes and a little no.
Why was it then that 2 or 3 days later, given that the Washington Post article came out on January 21st, why would you have had another conversation with Betty Curry asking or making the exact same statements to her?
I don't know that I did. I remember having this one time. I don't know that I did, sir.
If Mrs. Curry says you did, are you disputing that?
No, sir, I'm neither disputing.
Excuse me, is your representation that she testified that conversation was when?
I'm not making a representation as to what Mrs. Curry said. I'm asking the president if Mrs. Curry testified 2 or 3 days later, that 2 or 3 days after the conversation with the president on January 18th, that he called her into the Oval Office and went over the exact same statements that the president made to her on the 18th. Is that accurate? Is that a truthful statement by Mrs. Curry if she made it?
I do not remember how many times I talked to Betty Curry or when. I can't possibly remember that. I do remember when I first heard about this story breaking, trying to ascertain what the facts were, trying to ascertain what Betty's perception was. I remember that I was highly agitated, understandably, I think. And then I remember when I knew she was going to have to testify to the grand jury, and I felt terrible because she had been through this loss of her sister, this horrible accident at Christmas that killed her brother. Her mother was in the hospital. I was trying to make her understand that I didn't want her to be untruthful to the grand jury, and if her memory was different from mine, it was fine. Just go in there and tell them what she thought. So that's all I remember.
Mr. President, my name is Jackie Bennett. If I understand your current line of testimony, you're saying that your only interest in speaking with Ms. Curry in the days after your deposition was to refresh her own recollection?
Yes.
It was not to impart instructions on how she was to recall things in the future?
No, and certainly not under oath. That every day, Sir, Mr. Bennett, in the White House and in every other political organization, when you're subject to a barrage of press questions of any kind, you always try to make the best case you can consistent with the facts. That is, while being truthful. But nothing. So I was concerned for a day or two there about this as a press story only. I had no idea you were involved in it for a couple of days. I think Betty Curry's testimony will be that I gave her explicit instructions or encouragement to just go in the grand jury and tell the truth. That's what I told her to do, and I thought she would.
Mr. President, when did you learn about the Drudge Report reporting allegations of you having a sexual relationship with someone at the White House?
I believe it was the morning of the 18th, I think.
What time of day, sir?
I have no idea.
Early morning hours?
Yeah, I think somebody called me and told me about it. Maybe Bruce, maybe someone else. I'm not sure. But I learned early in the 18th of the Drudge Report.
Very early morning hours, sir?
Now, my deposition was on the 17th. Is that right?
On Saturday the 17th, sir.
Yeah, I think it was when I got up Sunday morning, I think. Maybe it was late Saturday night. I don't remember for
Did you
sure.
call Betty Curry, sir, after the Drudge Report hit the wire?
I did.
Did you call her at home?
I did. Was that the night of the 17th?
Night of the 17th, early morning hours of the 18th?
Okay, yes. That's because, yes, I worked with Prime Minister Netanyahu that night until about midnight. Isn't that right?
Excuse me, I think the question is directed, Mr. Bennett, if you could help out by putting the day of the week, I think that would be helpful.
Saturday night, Sunday morning.
Yes. I called Betty Curry as soon as I could after I finished with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and then the aftermath of that meeting, planning where we were going next in the Middle East peace process.
Can we take a 2-minute break, please?
May I ask one other question first?
Sure. I think where this is confused on dates, that's all.
That's what I didn't think it was the night of the 17th. Can we have a break and I could get straightened out?
Sure. May I ask one other question? This is a question I forgot to ask.
I don't want to get mixed up on these dates now. Go ahead.
This is, they wanted to know whether, they want us to clarify that the President's knowledge, your knowledge, Mr. President, as to the approach to our office this morning, that as we were told that you would give a general statement about the nature of your relationship with Ms. Lewinsky, which you have done, and yet that you did not want to go into any of the details about the relationship, and that if we pressed on going into the details, that you would object to going into the details. And the grand jurors, before they wanted to vote on some other matters, they wanted to know whether you were aware of that we were told that.
Well, Mr. Miller, I told you that this is not a fair question when you say you were told. Who told you?
Who told me what? The question?
You said the grand jury was told.
We have kept the grand jury informed, as we normally would, of the proceedings here.
Right. And I'm sorry, who are you representing who told you or the grand jurors anything? Is that our conversation?
Yes. Our conversation. Yes. That was, in substance, related to the grand jurors.
And what's your question to me, Mr. Bennett?
Whether you were aware of the facts that I just described.
Yes, sir. Let me say this. I knew that Mr. Kendall was going to talk with Judge Starr. What we wanted to do was to be as helpful as we could to you on the question of whether you felt I was being truthful. When I said I did not have sexual relations with Ms. Lewinsky, as defined in that definition 1 in my testimony. And I thought the best way to do that and still preserve some measure of privacy and dignity would be to invite all you and the grand jurors to ask, well, would you consider this, that, or the other thing covered by the definition? You asked me several questions there, and I did my best to answer whether I thought they were covered by the definition, and said if I thought they were covered, you could conclude from that my testimony is I did not do them. If things are not covered by the definition, and I don't believe they're covered, then I could not, then they shouldn't be within this discussion one way or the other. Now, I know this is somewhat unusual, but I would say to the grand jury, to put yourself in my position, this is not a typical grand jury testimony. I have to assume a report is going to Congress. There's a videotape being made of this, allegedly because only one member of the grand jury is absent. This is highly unusual. And in addition to that, I have sustained a breathtaking number of leaks of grand jury proceedings. And so I think I am right to answer all the questions about perjury, but not to say things which will be forever in the historic annals of the United States because of this unprecedented videotape and may be leaked at any time. I just think it's a mistake. And so I'm doing my best to cooperate with the grand jury and still protect myself, my family, and my office.
Thank you.
So ends another piece of the videotape. Now, there are several other pieces to play behind this, and I'm going to say once again that the next section also includes some sexually explicit material, so we want to issue that cautionary note. By the way, the transcript of today's videotape is now on the CBS website at cbs.com. You're watching continuing coverage of the White House under fire from CBS News. Now, President Clinton, among other things, has insisted that in the Paula Jones case, he was, quote, determined to walk through the minefield of this deposition without violating the law, and I believe I did, unquote. The question is whether he managed to do the same thing in this grand jury testimony, pointing out again that whether one believes it should be the case or not, the future of his presidency clearly hangs in the balance, and perhaps whether he can even hang on to the presidency or not. Now, before this videotape was released and made public, Bob Schieffer reported from Capitol Hill that Republicans were saying that it would in fact be a real hammer blow to the president. Bob is on Capitol Hill. He's been watching, as you have been doing, and also going to some of the documentation that backs it up. Bob, does it match what the Republicans told you?
Well, the early reads we got on all this, Dan, was that we'd see a president as we'd never seen him before, that we'd see a president who lost his temper. Clearly, you're not seeing that. It does strain credulity if you're to believe the version of events that the president lays out here. He